Thank you, Lascion Corlin. Taoiseach, I want to raise this morning the very significant step change in technology and development of wind farms across the country, which is causing enormous anxiety and concerns to communities at the length and breadth of the country. And whilst we are supportive, of course, of the development of wind energy, what has been happening in recent times is scaring communities and is causing huge division in many areas where very major proposals are being prepared. The size, the scale and the extent of the new proposals and the new proposed wind farms are genuinely causing major anxiety and huge concerns in communities across the country. And whereas wind turbines were originally of a scale maybe 50 to 60 to 70 metres high, what is now being proposed is wind turbines of up to 180 metres high. And it really is causing huge concern out there. In the Midlands, for example, we learned that there are proposals to build up to 700 such turbines. In East Cork, in our glass between Lisgould and Castlelyons, another major wind turbine or farm is being proposed, with about 18,000 acres of land covered. In the Glenties, with 475 hectares, there was a recent application that was turned down by on board Planola because of the scale of its impact on the locality. I understand that such large-scale wind farms have been developed in Ireland because of huge public opposition in Britain to such wind farms. And Taoiseach, worryingly, many of these farms are now close to large clusters of housing. In the East Cork, for example, there's over 300 houses actually in the midst of these particular industrial wind turbines. The turbines would be twice the size, just to give people a sense of the scale, twice the size of the Elysian, for example, is the height of the turbines that are now being proposed, which is an enormous height. And I don't think people have a proper appreciation out there of what actually is being proposed. And there's a fundamental absence of transparency governing all of this development. There's an absence of consultation with local residents and communities. Above all, there is an absence of a legislative framework to deal with this step change in technology and scale of development.
Thank you, Deputy.
And because these wind farms are being located close to residential areas, the health implications are causing concern to residents in terms of noise, in terms of shadow flicker, in terms of the destruction of amenity, and particularly residential amenity, the negative visual impact, and a range of other issues that are causing genuine concern to residents. Now, for example, just to illustrate the concern, Professor Alan Evans, who's written in the British Medical Journal, wrote to the residents of East Cork. He said, I quote, "I greatly sympathise with you in your plight. Quite simply, your life will be ruined if this goes ahead," unquote. So, Taoiseach, an intervention by government is required here. The planning guidelines of 2006 are outdated and were never framed in the context of the new technology that is emerging. So I'm asking you, is the government, and will the government, introduce legislation to govern the development of such large-scale industrial wind turbines? And as a matter of urgency, will you accelerate the updating of the guidelines to deal with this new technology?
Taoiseach.
Well, you've raised a very interesting point, Deputy Martin, and this is a serious matter. Our country imports between 6 and 7 billion worth of energy in fossil fuels every year. Clearly, the government have set targets to be reached by 2020 in terms of reduction of carbon emissions. This is an enormous bill which our people have to pay. Now, when I came into this House in the beginning, the Minister for Local Government at the time, or the Minister for the Environment at the time, had full and absolute authority in respect of planning permissions for any kind of development. And clearly, the path that followed led to serious problems and serious issues, tribunals and all that. So we've got a very robust, very independent, very analytical planning process now. You make the point that the guidelines do not deal with the extent of the change in technology and the sophistication of that these days. I'd argue differently, Deputy Martin. The environmental impact analysis that are now required for almost every kind of planning application are exhaustively extensive, I have to say, and clear consultation and discussion with communities are very important. Now, I know that there are two major applications for wind farms here in the country. I'd remind you that because of our relationship with Great Britain, because of the energy requirements of Great Britain between here and 2020 in particular, with over 50 billion to be spent, we signed a memorandum of understanding with Britain whereby if through the planning process here approval is given for wind development or for renewable energy development in general, we can export energy directly to the British market, subsidised by the British taxpayer as part of that memorandum of understanding. Now, I visited the wind farm myself between Charleroi and Brussels 2 years ago, which was one of the highest turbine masts in Europe. Farmers get paid about 100,000 a year for location of the mast, and these are gearbox-less turbines, so there's no the traditional noise that used to emanate from them. Where I live myself at home in the west, there are, I think, 40, 50 turbines on the hill there. Now some of them are 10, 15 years old, and they're not as extensive as the ones you're talking about. But I would say this to you, consultation is critical. And I understand, to be honest about this, that the companies involved here have had extensive and ongoing consultations with local communities. Now, you might disagree with that. I'm informed differently, and that's the point. That's the point of argument again. But I do recall 30 years ago when we had the provision of telecom masts around the country, where all the public meetings that used to take place about how these were going to be obstructionist on the landscape, how they were going to have all kinds of difficulties created, and they're a very important part of the development of our economy in terms of communications. So you asked me now to intervene here and update that. I'll certainly have the Minister for the Environment be cognizant of the guidelines that are there, because your own government actually did some good work here in terms of wind farm development, renewable energy development, and we want to build on that. But we can't interfere with what is a very extensive analytical planning process, where environmental impact analysis are really up to date with all and every aspect of intrusion on landscapes or interference in people's lives. Of course, when you look at the spread of population in the country, there are very few places where you can have extensive masts without being in sight of houses. I had an engagement with a fisherman one time in respect of the lake developments, and I said, well, what do you want? He said, I don't want to see any house within sight of the waters of this lake. I mean, some things are impossible. These are applications here that are part of our capacity to produce renewable energy, to sell into the British market, subsidised by the British taxpayer, but they are subject to a very strict environmental analysis, a very strict planning process, and I can't interfere with that. But I will ask the Minister to reflect on the guidelines that, as you say, are not updated. In my view, my understanding from the environmental impact analysis that are submitted, they are exhaustive in dealing with all of these very modern issues that are raised these days.
Well, supplementary question, Deputy
Taoiseach, I'm very alarmed by your response. Who represents the citizen here? Is this House meant to represent the citizen and protect the citizen? I'm not asking you to interfere in individual planning applications. Whether you're aware or not, your own government actually commenced a review of the 2006 guidelines, but unfortunately only allowed 2 weeks for submissions from the general public. The point is the 2006 guidelines are hopelessly out of date with the new technology. We're not talking, Taoiseach, about a couple of turbines on the side of the hill. We're talking about 700 wind turbines being proposed in the Midlands, exclusively for export, with guidelines that from any objective, evidence-based and from professionals in the field are hopelessly out of date and inappropriate for what is being proposed. The health implications are real for the residents who are close to such large-scale industrial wind turbines. What I simply ask you, Taoiseach, is this, is to create and bring in a legislative framework to govern the development of such large industrial wind farms. Simple as that. And the planning authorities need guidelines. But even the county development plans are quite ambiguous in terms of their provision in this area. And I've looked at the county development plan in Cork, for example, just for one example, just to see how I couldn't understand how wind turbines so high could be so close, 500 metres, to houses. Now, we had this before with afforestation, when there was a great momentum and understanding then for afforestation, but that went overboard then. Houses were completely enclosed by massive forests. Wrong. What happened to citizens on that occasion was wrong. The same is going to happen here, Taoiseach. The citizens out there are concerned, they're anxious, and why? Because there is no consultation. You said there's extensive consultation. There is not extensive consultation going on. Talk to your own deputies in the Midlands. That's why one of the government deputies has tabled a legislation of his own here, seeking to have this dealt with. That's why a senator in the government ranks tabled legislation in the Shannon nearly 6 months ago to deal with this issue. And where you have an absence of consultation, and where you have an absence of transparency, and a lack of acknowledgement of genuine concerns by moderate people out there, you're looking for trouble, Taoiseach.
Thank you, Deputy.
And you're out of touch on this issue, and you need to get in touch with this issue fairly quickly, Taoiseach, and provide a framework that at least protects the health of residents, the residential amenity of residents, and the visual impact on residents. That's the least that residents and citizens out there can expect from their government.
I don't know whether you're for renewable energy or not from what your contribution that you're making here, but I reject your assertion that we're being in any way alarmist about people here who have every right to live where they choose to live and in accordance with proper planning conditions. As any application that comes in for industry or for private needs or whatever is subject to planning applications. I don't know whether the major applications that are here are part of the critical infrastructure process and go directly to Ardbóthmála. But don't tell me, Deputy Martin, that you have all the answers here. I'm informed that there is extensive consultation with communities and with people and with personnel. In the same way, Deputy Martin, as when the gas lines are put through the country, everybody is consulted individually, or when the major motorways were being built, there was extensive consultation. And a process for arbitration or for appeasement or for decision at the end of the day. These, I cannot say.
Please.
I cannot say, Deputy Martin, whether the applications for wind turbines would be successful or not. I cannot speak for Ardbóthmála. All I can say to you is that the process of updating the guidelines is one element, but we have no function in determining the outcome of this in the context of the independence of Ardbóthmála, and I'm quite sure you accept that. You mentioned the fact that the planning process does not take account of the changes that occur in technology these days. My understanding from the very extensive environmental impact analysis that are required to be submitted, that reach thousands and thousands of pages of detailed analysis, are taken into account. In fact, the legacy that was left behind in regard to agriculture means that the expertise was never there to deal with the detail of environmental impact analysis in different parts around the country, and I've had contact from communities about this. I share everybody's view that consultation is necessary, that information is necessary, and had we had that in a lot of other major applications around the country, things might have been much more smooth.
Thank you.
These are not a reality yet. I cannot say whether they will become a reality in the context of their applications. There's a process there that is independent, that is robust, that takes account all of these things. It is a matter for the promoters and the local authorities involved to have the extensive consultation, which I support with communities, so that they're fully informed as to what's involved here.
Margaret, Jerry
Are you intend to be in a legislative framework of government? Yes or no?
please. Sorry, Deputy. I've called Deputy Adams.
No, it's not. Do you plan to legislate? I asked the question, will there be a legislative framework of government development? But that's all I asked.
That we're being alarmist here. We have a very independent,
All right.
robust
Well, that's
planning
that's over. Sorry.
The opposite, Dave. I don't think you're showing any concern at all.
Please.